Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we discuss why the political system is dysfunctional and polarized, and on every show we try and find solutions. No sense just complaining about it. You got to fix the problems, and we try and do that on our show. Every year about now, the Aspen Institute holds their Ideas Festival, and we try and go over there and kidnap interesting people to talk to. They've got a national perspective. They're at the forefront of what's going on in the world. And today we've got a terrific guest, Charlie Sykes, who's with MSNBC. He's on NPR radio on a brand new show called Indivisible. He's written quite a bit, and he's been a conservative commentator for over 20 years now, and I'm really looking forward to getting his perspective. It's always unique to get a good conservative here in Aspen once in a while. It's a very liberal community, as you know, and every year for the Aspen's Idea Festival, there's a token conservative or two, and we've been lucky enough to have the conservative token or two each year join us on our show, and Charlie was gracious enough to join us today. So Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Did you get all your shots and everything you needed to come here?
Everybody's been very nice so far.
I know.
So far.
You know, it's an amazing town,
Yeah.
and it is liberal, and it's getting more liberal all the time, but it's not as if this is the part of the world where, you know, the vitriol is going to be spewing at you while you're sitting here. You know?
As you mentioned, I work with MSNBC and NPR, and as a conservative working for them, this is nothing, right?
So you've been in this milieu for 20-some years, right? And for the people that want to point at the conservatives and blame them for what's going on, they'll point to right around when you got started, and they'll point to Newt Gingrich, and they'll say, that's when it all happened. No. So when did it all happen for you? When did you see this starting to get dysfunctional, and what's your perspective on that part of the world?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and I've spent a long time. My book is called How the Right Lost Its Mind, and I tried to ask myself that question because initially I was thinking, well, Donald Trump drops out of the sky on this otherwise coherent movement and hijacks it. But it's as I've asked myself that question, when did it actually start? When did we start losing our minds? When did we become so tribal, willing to accept so many bizarre things? You do have to start running that clock back, and there's a lot of dates you could put it. But I mean, the fact is that we have become more, exponentially more tribal as opposed to principled. You've seen this evolution from being a movement of ideas to being a movement of echo chambers, of tribal loyalty, and now, quite frankly, of cult of personality. When did this all happen? Was it when some of the grifters took over the Tea Party movement? Was it when the conservative movement became the perpetual outrage machine, or when we outsourced the thought leadership to people like Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh? This has been a long time coming. Now, by the way, the left has its own problems, but what I've dealt with is how the right, even though it wins elections, has run off the rails.
And I told you, I'm the third party guy now,
Right.
and I'm kind of anti-Republican and Democrat. I'm anti-liberal and conservative. I think you just feed off each other. The conservatives learn a trick or two, and then the liberals say, hey, that's a good trick. Why don't we try that trick? Okay. So, there's a debt ceiling. Hey, let's not pass that legislation. Let's not have more debt, and the Republicans try, and then the Democrats try, and Obama makes that vote. And then Obama becomes president. Hey, what do you mean we can't have a debt ceiling? So I just think everybody feeds off each other.
Yes. And it has been fascinating how, for example, that the conservatives have become what they despise, that they justify their tactics because, well, what about the Democrats? They did the same thing. And we've almost gotten to a period, I will admit this is a slight overstatement, but we're getting close to a period where it's not even really about policies or ideas anymore. It is just about these tribal loyalties, and you watch the two sides just switch their standards and their beliefs depending on who's in power and who's out of power. And I've described in other venues, and remember, I'm a conservative talk show host, so I like the idea of a conservative media. I like the idea of some place that tells the different side of the story. What happened over the last couple of years was, at least for me, was the recognition that something had gone wrong, that rather than creating an alternative media, we had created an alternative reality, that we had created these alternative reality silos on the right and on the left, where the two sides no longer talk to one another. Right. If they talk to one another at all, they demonize one another. They justify any tactics in order to defeat the other side. And, you know, watching it as a conservative, I mean, I'm old enough, you're probably old enough too to remember when conservatives said things like character matters, all that stuff. And then to go through last year and watch as many conservatives embrace Donald Trump, some of these were the same people who back in the 1990s made the case, well, we can't, you know, we have to impeach Bill Clinton because of his character, but then lecture us last year as conservatives that we needed to overlook all of Donald Trump's character issues because, well, we had to win.
No, and but that's part of the problem. Hasn't winning become everything?
Yeah.
And I was talking to one of my guests earlier in the week, and from my perspective, it's not just that winning has become everything, it's just that politics has become ubiquitous. There's no period for governing anymore. We're just in a constant campaign mode, and it's an ugly constant campaign mode. There's no time for policies, you said. Who sits back and talks policy?
Right. Well, you know, and it really has come down to when I was trying to figure out what happened here, and then, by the way, I've used this line before, and I've borrowed it from Jonah Goldberg. As a conservative watching, you know, the Trump takeover, you know, watching conservatives who I've known for 20 or 30 years decide that they're going to accept these standards and this candidacy, it was like watching the invasion of the body snatchers, watching them as they were taken over. But the explanation to all of this is that not only is politics ubiquitous, and not only is it winner take all, but it's that binary choice. In the 2016 election was a real illustration of how binary our politics has become, either or. And as long as you have that choice, that no matter how awful Trump might be, no matter, you know, his admission that he sexually assaults women, or he's a serial liar, he makes fun of the disabled, whatever you want to say about it, you know, the majority of Republican voters have now been conditioned to saying, yes, but it's either him or it's Hillary, the binary choice. And, you know, she's so much worse. And as long as that's the case, I think you're going to have this race to the bottom, that we will have this period where we will no longer hold the candidates accountable for accomplishing anything or for their conduct, as long as we can demonize the other choice, which will always be worse.
And that's where it's at.
That is where it's at.
So I talk about my show a lot, and we start with dysfunctional, we start with polarized. To me, polarized is okay as long as polarized can still yield compromise. Right. As I told him, I'm a lobbyist in the 90s in Illinois. We'd have Pate Phillip, who was an ultra-conservative Republican, and we had liberal Democrats. They'd still get in the room every year and make a budget deal, and they'd make their deals. That art was lost in Illinois, and it's kind of being lost everywhere. Yeah. So we don't compromise anymore. What's really bothering me, and I know you came to talk about this the Aspen Institute, is the lack of civility that even goes with it now. See, people used to be able to compromise. Then they used to be able to disagree respectfully. But now it's just plain ugly. So I'm going to wind you up a little and let you go on this one. Well, how did we get there, and how do we get out of it?
Now, one of the things I had to address at the Aspen Festival was, you know, how do we restore civility to our politics? And unfortunately, I was probably the wrong person to ask that, because my take on this, that everything that's happening that is bad in this discourse and in the media is about to get worse. I mean, I just see the partisan animosity ticking up. I see the level of the rhetoric, you know, on social media accelerating. And let's be honest about it, the President of the United States, for better or for worse, is always the role model in chief. And many of his supporters model his behavior, and he has taken the level of vitriol to a completely new level that would never have been imaginable. And there are studies that actually quantify how much we hate each other and what we're willing to say about each other. That right now, partisanship is actually more toxic than racial prejudice in a lot of ways. That, you know, the people react. When it comes to issues of race and ethnicity and sex, we actually have social norms about what we can say about the other group. You can't say certain things. Right. There are no norms really in effect for what Democrats can say about Republicans, what Republicans can say about Democrats. And to the extent that there are some norms, Trump has basically blown them aside. So I get a sense that this level of lack of civility, you know, despite some of the kumbaya talk you heard after the shooting, the baseball diamond shooting, is going to get worse.
Come on, that lasted at least 24 hours. Let's.
but you know what?
I shouldn't be laughing, but it's about as long as it lasted.
So
right? 24 hours.
You've become cynical too, right?
I'm past cynical. That's why I have a TV show.
See, that was even as it was happening. I was talking to some of the people that I was on with, And it's like, you know this isn't real. You know that we've gone through this too many times, and and everyone wants to be more civil, but they won't be.
Right. Well, I noticed though that you've talked about that on your show, but I went back to your radio show, which just started this year, and I noticed the first show you had was on alternative facts.
Yep.
So you're on a brand new TV show.
Right.
You could probably start out with anything you want, and you wanted to start out big.
Right.
And you picked alternative facts.
Right.
And I think that's somewhat telling. So how did you choose that for your first show, and how did the first show play out? How did people respond to that?
Well, was that the show I had George Will on with?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
because the number of sort of
I think it was.
principled conservatives who've not gone along with Trump were a very, very small little fraternity. And I knew that we were going to be in the wilderness, but it turns out a much smaller desert island, so I wanted to have him on the show and people like Bill Kristol. But this is one of the most disturbing things about our new politics. It is the fact that we have become the post-truth political era. That it's not new that politicians lie. It's not new that there's false propaganda. What's new is how widespread it is and how many people are willing to accept it. Mm-hmm. How many people are willing to believe things that are not true. And Donald Trump is the symbol of this alternative fact world. This is not a problem for the media. This is not a problem even for politicians. This is a democracy problem. Right. If we don't know what's true, if we don't know who we can trust, and so in a sense, you can't even start talking about the state of our politics, where we go, how we fix it, until you ask, what is the state of truth? Well, what is truth? Do people care about truth? Why is there so much untruth?
See, now you're part of the media, and I can't
Yes.
paint you with the entire media brush,
No.
but I don't think the media is truthful anymore. And I think part of their job is to be the watchdog of this. And maybe it's not that they lie, but they go out of their way, I think, to distort a story to their unique audiences to the point where that distortion is not representative of the story anymore. And so where does this end? In other words, politicians maybe expect them to lie, and then they start lying.
Yeah.
But I want the media to tell me the facts.
Right.
I want to get the truth from them. So if they start that, then as you said, how do you ever pull it back in?
Well, but also the term media, we got to define our terms here. What is the media? At one time it was, three major networks, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Now, of course, everybody in their basement is media. Right. The conservatives have their media. The Trump supporters have their media. This is what I mean by these, the echo chambers, the alternative reality silos. If you want to believe something, you will find somebody in the media that will tell you that. If you don't want to believe something, you will find somebody in the media who will tell you not to believe it. Now, the mainstream media, I assume you're referring to...
Let's do mainstream.
So who are we talking about here? Are we talking about...
Well, again, I've told my viewers, when I wake up in the morning, on one side I've got the Wall Street Journal, on the other side I have the New York Times. I like the Economist to keep up with things. I'm from Chicago, so I'll hit the Tribune once in a while. That's my universe.
Okay, now I say this, I have to put this in context, and this is why this whole experience has been kind of painful for me. Yeah. As a conservative talk show host, like every other conservative in America for the last 20 years, I've criticized the media on a regular basis. Their bias, their selectivity, the double standards, all of that, and it's all deserved. In fact, part of my plea to the media, I'm a former newspaper guy, was, guys, your readers and your viewers are savvy. You protect your credibility. You're squandering it, and now we're seeing the price that's paid. Having said that, we got to the point where I think that we have delegitimized the media. And I've told a story about how I would always push back on the fake news or the hoaxes. And increasingly what I found was that I couldn't come up with a source that people would believe. If I said, well, it's obviously that's not true. It's in the Wall Street Journal, or so it's the New York Times. Well, those are liberal rags. So what we had done was we had totally eliminated any independent journalism out there to check the falsehood. Right. That's a dangerous thing. My sense is, and I don't misunderstand me, most of the journalism in the outlets that you're describing has actually been pretty good. I think they're trying to do a better job, but when they don't, as when CNN made a massive mistake recently, it's devastating to the credibility because people then ask, who do I trust, who do I believe? And that's the environment that cynical demagogues will exploit. You asked me about my radio show, Indivisible, on WNYC. My favorite show was when I had Garry Kasparov, who's the former world chess champion.
I'm reading his book.
Okay, Russian dissident.
Yes.
Brilliant man who I think convinced me, first of all, that you have had to have lived under an authoritarian regime where truth didn't matter in order to understand what's happening now. But his point was, and he tweeted it out, he said, you know, the point of propaganda is not to convince you of a certain fact. The point of propaganda is to break down your critical sensibility, to make you either doubt what the truth is or lose interest in what the truth is. Mm-hmm. And that was an interesting thing, and we're living in an era of the alternative fact where I think a lot of Americans basically don't know who to believe, so you know what they do? They believe the facts, they accept the facts they want to accept. They confirm their bias.
Right.
You know, the term is motivated reasoning.
Right.
And because it's easier, it's more comfortable, and we live in a universe where if you want to believe something, no matter how bizarre, you can. So the media needs to push back on that, and they need to protect their credibility aggressively.
And use the word trust.
Yes, trust.
You've got to be able to trust the media. Right. And I would think in a world of Trump, whatever the world of Trump is, the media should be even more on guard than ever.
Yes.
They should not want to get caught, because when
Yes.
they get caught, that is an aha moment for Trump, and that just feeds everything you just explained. It feeds into it, and then you can't get out of it. You're in a spiral.
Actually, right before you picked me up today, I was thinking of an article that I have to write for a publication on the media and in this age, and I was going to make that point, which is that, you know, here's the media has two big problems. First of all, there's these important things that they have to write about at a time when there's low trust. They have to understand that they can write the best journalism in the world, and it might not penetrate into these alternative reality silos, by which I mean you have 40% of the electorate that will discount anything. Right. I believe that Richard Nixon would have survived Watergate if he had the current media environment.
Interesting.
Very easy for me to imagine. But the other important point, and I agree with what you just said, is that you have to understand you have got to get it right. Because what you saw recently was the way that Trump, you know, using the full power of the White House and all of his support, they weaponized that mistake. And the damage that did is far beyond CNN. And it really feeds into that whole narrative. So I don't know how that happened. I don't know what the backstory was, but that was a very significant setback for the idea of trust.
Now, I know, as you mentioned, you know, you're a small fraternity of people who didn't move over to the Trump side of the ledger. And then you talked about as president now. I think I was surprised, and I'm guessing you were surprised, that he didn't step up to that level and understand the decorum and how the presidency is handled. And he just kept the locker room speech flowing. So I'm saying I was surprised by that. I'm guessing you were as well, or?
You know, surprised, not surprised, because, I mean, you know, having spent a year warning people, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, this man should not be president, then when he, you know, lives up to all of that or lives down to it, I shouldn't have been surprised. On the other hand, I agree with you that you would think that there'd be a level of seriousness that if you want to succeed. In fact, I was speaking at the festival with somebody who voted for Trump and was trying to make the case for giving him a chance. And I said, you ought to be the one who's the most upset, because you have invested all of this faith and confidence in him to do things that you regard as important, and he refuses to step up to do the job. He refuses to show the discipline, the character, just the hard work to be able to get it done. And I think that, unfortunately, there's also this, we've talked about, you know, the media ecosystem around him. They enable him. So yesterday, the senators, all the Republican senators, go in and meet with the President of the United States to talk about health care reform. This is 1/6 of the entire U.S. economy. Tens of millions of people are affected. Arguably the most important legislative vote of his presidency. And the senators come out, and the story they tell is basically that he obviously clearly was completely unfamiliar with the basic details of the legislation. You know? Right. This is part of that extraordinary moment we are in.
Although, in fairness to the president, Nancy Pelosi wasn't familiar with the bill when they passed it either. But that's the scary part. Maybe someone could get familiar once in a while with what it is we're actually doing here, right?
Well, okay. Actually, no, I was a conservative talk show host at that time when that happened, and we spent months and years mocking her for that comment. You have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. And now, you have the Republicans who are ramming it through at an exponentially different level. I mean, here's some numbers.
Yeah.
The Senate Health Committee, I think, had something like 47 hearings on Obamacare. The Senate Finance Committee had 52. The Senate spent 25 days debating it. And guys like me were saying, you're ramming it through, you're ramming it through, you're ramming it through. Right. And here you have Mitch McConnell, does it in secret, and wants to get it done, what, in 3 days with 0 hearings. So now, there are limits to, maybe we've come up against the limits of hypocrisy for some conservatives. I don't know.
No, it's scary times. And you mentioned another word there, debate. I don't know what happened to debate. There's no such thing as debate anymore, particularly in the U.S. Senate. If ever there was a place for debate, it was the U.S. Senate, and that's a lost art, right?
I mean, the U.S. Senate, formerly known as the world's greatest deliberative body.
Yeah, something like that. So you had your first show, and it was on alternative facts. And then you digressed to something, a little easier to talk about. Are we losing our country? Which is, I think, what we're talking about now. But I think it tells something when this is how you started your program. This is where the news was to you. So we talked about the viewers on the alternative facts. People are calling in. Are we losing our country? What are they saying? What's the guy in the street telling you on the radio?
Okay, so this is a radio. This was WNYC, which is the flagship station for public radio in New York City. So you can imagine kind of what the audience is. Okay. But the intent
probably
of the show,
not totally conservative.
Well, no, and they had like 600 stations. I'm sorry, I remember, but quite a number of stations all across the country. And we had a remarkable number of conservatives who called in. And the whole point was to try to bridge that divide, to try to get liberals and conservatives to talk with one another, which never happens. And at that moment, as this presidency began, I sensed that both sides were going to answer that question: are we losing our country differently? I mean, Republicans, conservatives have been saying that throughout the entire Obama presidency, but then liberals were feeling that with the Trump presidency. So I wanted to get some. Here was a moment where I thought both sides were going to say similar things, but for completely different reasons, which they did.
No, sure. So they're in the same place, but for different reasons. Well, that's how I thought about what I call the Trump phenomenon, the Sanders phenomenon. And someone said to me, there's two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
And so I assume that's kind of what you were getting on your show.
Yes.
There's exasperation on the right and the left. They don't know where to go with it. And they want to solve it differently, but they're feeling the same pain.
And it's a level of disillusionment in our institutions. I think it's a good thing to be skeptical of government. However, if that morphs into a corrosive cynicism, you have a different problem. As a lawyer, you might appreciate this. There's a very interesting essay recently written by a Yale law professor who talks about this phenomenon, and he says, we overuse terms like constitutional crisis. He says we are not in a constitutional. We're not close to a constitutional crisis. What we are experiencing, however, is what he calls constitutional rot, the loss of confidence in our institutions and our democratic norms, and that in some ways Trump is a symptom of this loss of understanding or respect for all of these democratic norms. And that was one of the things we talked about on this show, that I think a lot of us, the shock of the election and the Trump presidency was this recognition that a lot of the things, these norms and standards that we had taken for granted were actually pie crust thin and they were broken. Also the recognition that a lot of the things that we thought would protect us, the laws and the checks and balances, which are still working, but a lot of those are based also on just the sense that you'd have a president who respected the office, who respected the Constitution. So this is where we're in this uncharted territory. What if you have a president who does not fundamentally understand or respect those norms, and an electorate that is ignorant of American civics, ignorant of American history, and maybe indifferent to some of these standards?
And you point out being indifferent or maybe doesn't understand history. Here's one of my concerns. And I talk on my show about demographics and millennials and where things are going in the future. And I have 3 daughters. The oldest is 30, youngest is 21. I don't think any of my daughters have lived through a time when government functioned. So you have an entire generation, not just these millennials trying to figure out their way through society. They don't understand government. And that's kind of scary to me because they become the next leaders and they've grown up in this period of constitutional rot, correct?
Yes. Now, because I'm usually the pessimist here, let me turn that around and say
I'm out pessimistic.
Oh no! I'm often described as the Prince of Darkness because of everything is going to get worse. However, you could make a case though that the millennials might be might be the bright spot, because they are very clearly unaligned with the major political parties. Right. They might be open to fundamental change, and if you ever get to a third party, the key to that will be to appeal to millennials who are not locked into this binary system that we have right now.
I couldn't agree more. I've done a few shows on it. Those are my guys.
I know.
They're unaffiliated. They're not locked in. They don't like the constitutional rot, and maybe they will be the next generation. Right. It just bothers me that they don't have a model to grow from.
They don't have. Although I got a lot of ridicule for this, but I was on the Morning Joe show at one point, and I said, I got to tell you, I got to admit to you, I'm going to say something that I've never said before. I am envious of the French.
Really?
Well, because of what happened with their election, where you had, Macron comes out of nowhere,
right?
Blows up the entire party structure, right. Makes them irrelevant, invents essentially an entire political party from scratch, right. which now has an overwhelming majority in their National Assembly. So it is possible, Now, we're not France, right. and I think anyone that says that we should be more like the French is, going to get the kind of ridicule I got for that. But it was a fascinating phenomenon. Right. I mean, the two dominant parties that have basically run the country for generations, they've just been completely trash canned.
Yeah, I have to get him on my show.
Yeah.
Well, you've been a great guest.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy Aspen. Enjoy the Ideas Fest. And for those of you that watch today's show, as we always try and do, we want to educate you, but we want to have fun. And if you don't have fun today, you're never going to have fun on television. But you can have more fun if you follow Charlie on his radio show, Indivisible, on WNYC, correct? And you can catch him on MSNBC. So keep having fun with Charlie Sykes and stick with us. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem.